For decades, this incident was rooted in speculation and fear. The facts were either suppressed or cooked up. In 1940, more than 20,000 Polish prisoners of war disappeared in Soviet territory without a trace.
Censorship, control, and the Katyn case in general were under a strict ban.
The Katyn forest in the Smolensk region. This is where a mass grave of people in Polish military uniform was first discovered. That was in 1943, during the German occupation.
The Poles lay in their graves in 3 or 4 rows, side by side. Some were even layered on top of one another.
Who ordered the execution of the Polish prisoners of war? When exactly were they killed? What do eyewitnesses have to say about it after more than 50 years of silence? Why were the details of the Katyn tragedy kept secret for so long? In Russia's northwest lies a monastery on an island in Lake Seliger. In 1940, it housed the Ostashkov prison camp, where more than 5,000 Polish army servicemen and police were imprisoned. Boris Karpov was just a child at the time. He found out how the monastery had been turned into a prison camp for prisoners of war from a relative who was serving in the Soviet Union's secret police, the NKVD.
Every day, a special train was coming to the city of Ostashkov. The Polish prisoners of war barely had any roof over their heads. Therefore, all of the monastery's buildings were hastily adapted for their accommodation. Triple plank beds were made for that purpose.
Polish prisoners of war were brought to the Soviet Union soon after the start of World War II. German troops had occupied Poland in the autumn of 1939, and Soviets entered the country's eastern regions. The Poles were sent to prison camps in Ostashkov, Starobelsk, and Kozelsk.
The Poles were held in order to prevent any potential riots or attempts to restore Poland's territorial integrity. Among them was career officer Jakob Wajda, the father of Polish film director Andrzej Wajda. Jakob and his fellow army servicemen were sent to the Kozelsk camp in the Smolensk region.
Unlike my father, most of those taken prisoner were not career officers. Rather, they represented the Polish intelligentsia. They were university professors, high school teachers, actors and artists among them. In short, all those who had been drafted into the army in 1939.
In August that year, the Soviet Union and Germany signed a non-aggression treaty in Moscow, which later became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This covert document detailed the partition of Eastern Europe. On September 1, 1939, Germany attacked Poland. By September 17th, Soviet troops entered Poland as well. This rare footage shows a joint parade in the town of Brest. The Soviet brigade commander Krivoshein and General Guderian of Germany share a viewing platform. The Polish army had now ceased to exist.
I never saw my father from that moment on. There was no word from him until he was taken prisoner by the Soviets.
Most of the police officers and frontier troops were sent to the Ostashkov camp, one of 3 used for Polish prisoners of war. A dam built by the Poles to link the island to the lakeside still serves as a reminder of their time there. The Poles stayed for just over 6 months. In April 1940, the first groups of prisoners were then taken to an unknown destination. The Poles walked to the nearby railway station across the frozen ice of Lake Seliger.
They were actually rejoicing. The guards told them that they were being sent closer to the Polish border so that they could be handed over to the Polish government when the time comes.
Top secret. From a report Ostashkov guards sent to NKVD headquarters. The prisoners of war are in good spirits. It is apparent they have a strong desire to leave the camp. Those staying behind are envious of the ones who are about to leave. They think they're going home. The evacuation is proceeding in an orderly manner without incident.
Izabela Sariusz-Skomska's grandfather, Boleslav Skomski, worked at the Polish prosecutor's office. When Soviet troops entered Poland on September 17, 1939, he was arrested after being branded a suspect. When he was put in a POW camp, he had only one opportunity to send a letter. That was in late 1939.
Once a week, my granny sent a postcard to the address of the prison camp my granddad had given her. For some time, the postcard simply disappeared without a trace. But starting with the spring of 1940, they were sent back. They bore the mark, address unknown.
1943. The peak of the war between the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany. It was then that secret burials were found in the village of Katyn near Smolensk. The German Army's medical corps said the bodies of more than 4,000 Polish army officers had been found in 7 ditches in a forest. They had been exhumed under the supervision of Professor Gerhard Butz, a well-known anthropologist from Breslau University. Butz later told the International Red Cross Committee about his findings.
On April 13, 1943, Radio Berlin announced that Polish army officers and policemen had been shot and killed by the NKVD in 1940. The Soviets refuted it 2 days later. They claimed that the Polish officers had been executed by the Germans in the autumn of 1941.
In 1943, Dmitry Khudych was 13 years old. He's lived in the Katyn forest area all his life. The German authorities took him and many other local people to the exhumation site. Dmitry thinks the message was clear.
Nothing would have happened if the Germans hadn't uncovered anything. It was a political matter. Mind you, a Polish army had been formed in Soviet territory. So the aim was to show those Poles that they had no business fighting on the Russian side. See what they've done? You'll be in for it too.
In the Polish capital, Warsaw, the so-called Katyn lists began to appear towards the end of spring 1943. People queued for hours in front of newsstands to read them. New names were added to the lists every day.
The name of my granddad appeared on one of the lists shortly after such lists were made public. My father often said he remembered the day when he learned that he had become an orphan, after his father's death and his mother's death 6 months before.
In late 1943, Soviet troops drove the Germans out of the Smolensk region. Soon another medical commission, this time led by the well-known Soviet surgeon Nikolai Budenka, started work in the Katyn forest. Its task was to find evidence that the Polish prisoners had been killed by the Germans in 1941, after they'd invaded the Soviet Union.
When a German-made Walter pistol was found there, that became the main argument in support of the claim that it was the Germans that executed the Polish officers. The theory that it was the Nazis that killed them was based on this discovery.
Anton Antonov Ovseyenko is a former political prisoner whose father belonged to Lenin's inner circle. He set up a Gulag museum commemorating the victims of political repressions. A friend who worked at the Institute of Forensic Studies told how evidence in the Katyn case had been faked in the Soviet Union in 1944.
The woman was on duty at that time. She saw the remains being pulled out of boxes and the pockets being stuffed with newspapers and letters bearing falsified dates. The aim was to create the impression that all that had happened in 1941 rather than in 1940. All the evidence was supposed to demonstrate that nobody but the Germans were to blame.
Around the same time, a manhunt was underway to spot locals who believed that the Poles had been executed by the NKVD. Needless to say, they also met a tragic fate.
If I had believed the Russians had killed him, I would have been dead for sure.
After the Soviet Medical Commission, led by Budenka, finished its work in 1944, a memorial cross was erected in Katyn. The inscription read, "Polish prisoners of war, executed by Hitler's troops in 1941, rest in peace here." Among those attending the unveiling were Polish army servicemen from the Kastushka division, who were fighting on the Soviet side.
Delegates in Katyn represented various units, including my 5th Regiment of the 2nd Infantry Division. Everybody said they had no doubt that the crime had been committed by the Germans.
After the end of World War II, Poland joined the Socialist Bloc. From then on, any discussion regarding Katyn was taboo. In contrast to the official Soviet memorial in Katyn, people in Poland flocked to Warsaw to commemorate the countrymen who died in captivity. Relatives of the dead had to hold their memorial services in secret, but not any longer.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
The silence lasted nearly half a century. Many relatives of the executed Polish prisoners of war didn't live long enough to learn the secret truth of the Katyn tragedy. For many years, only the most senior communist officials had access to these Soviet archives. Most of the documents are marked top secret. In 1990, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev ordered this folder containing reports on the Katyn executions to be removed from the archives and handed over to Poland. The most valuable document is a memo sent to Stalin by Lavrenti Beria, the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, in April 1940.
To Comrade Stalin, the Polish prisoners are trying to continue their counter-revolutionary activities in the camps. Each of them is only looking for an opportunity to join the struggle against the Soviet government. The NKVD of the USSR feels it's necessary to apply to them a special procedure, execution by a firing squad. Signed, Beria, People's Commissar of the Internal Affairs of the USSR.
That was the first time that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev officially declared that the Soviet government was to blame. He offered his condolences and gave me a folder of documents containing lists of executed Polish officers. The next day, I went to Katyn and paid tribute to the memory of those who were killed.
Now it was necessary to find the secret graves of the Polish prisoners. The trail led investigators to the town of Ostashkov, where one of the concentration camps used to be. There were still a few surviving witnesses to help the team, and it was proved once again that in April 1940 the Poles were taken away by railroad, and nobody saw them alive again.
Polish officers were brought here to this railway junction. They were put into boxcars and taken away in this direction by trains. Much later, we found out that they had been taken to the city of Kalinin.
From Ostashkov, the train journey to Kalinin took 24 hours. In 1940, the communist official Mikhail Kalinin was among other high-ranking officials endorsing the execution of the Poles. The building standing opposite the monument to Kalinin once housed the NKVD's regional headquarters. This is where the lives of the Polish prisoners were cut short. More than 50 years later, Dmitry Tokarev, who ran the local NKVD, was interrogated by investigators from the Military Prosecutor General's office.
After we showed Dmitry Tokarev archived documents proving his guilt, he realized that it was in vain to deny anything and gave a detailed true testimony.
My men didn't shoot more than 300 people a day. Only once did they shoot as many. That had to be done under the cover of darkness because the nights were now too short. So they brought 250 people at a time, and we shot them during the night.
Those about to be shot were taken to the basement one by one, supposedly to have their papers checked. But once there, they were stripped of their personal belongings and valuables. Only then did it occur to the prisoners that they were never going to leave that place alive.
Из допроса бывшего начальника НКВД Дмитрия Степановича Токарева стало известно, что пистолеты для расстрелов привез Василий Блохин, бывший комендант НКВД СССР. Он привез целый чемодан пистолетов «Вальтер». Перед проведением акции эти пистолеты он выдавал исполнителям расстрелов, а после проведения этой акции пистолеты изымались и готовились к новым расстрелам.
After the biography of a Polish prisoner of war was completely identified, two men would take him by the arms and lead him into a cell just like this one. The walls of the cells were covered with felted cloth to absorb noise. A third man fired a shot from a Walter pistol at the back of the head of the prisoner.
When Dmitry Tokarev was interrogated in 1991, he agreed to sketch a route leading to the site where the bodies of executed Polish officers had been buried. There was a building here where senior NKVD officials relaxed. Tokarev's dacha, or country house, was nearby.
It's a very picturesque place by the riverside. Top NKVD officials spent a lot of time relaxing here. The wives and children of minor officials lived here, and large ditches only 30 meters from the houses were filled with thousands of bodies. The technology of covering up traces of mass executions was worked through down to the minutest detail, but in the Polish case, NKVD men had to do their job as fast as they could. The bodies of Polish prisoners were tossed into large ditches and covered with earth.
The land surrounding what used to be the NKVD dachas in the Tver region was examined in the summer of 1991. The first horrific finds were uncovered a few days later. The investigators' job was made easier due to the fact that there is compact clay soil in the Tver region, which doesn't allow air to filter through.
The bodies in that mass grave showed almost no signs of decomposition. There was an easily identifiable Polish military uniform on some of them. Others were clad in the uniform of Polish police. Their bodies and arms were almost intact, and this is how we lifted fossilized remains.
Write it down, please. Polish forensic scientists joined their Soviet counterparts in identifying the bodies. Many of the personal items and papers that once belonged to the dead prisoners were later taken to a laboratory at Krakow's Institute of Forensic Studies for further examination.
This job helps me to realize many things. When I study all these items, glasses, lighters, cigarette cases, I imagine how they lived, wrote letters, missed each other, played dice and smoked cigarettes. Each item reminds of a real person, and I start to understand what life in the camp was like.
There is a memorial museum in the Mednaya forest. It features documents and accounts of the Poles buried here, and also of the Soviets who died during Stalin's reign of terror. The death penalty was handed down to more than 5,000 people in the Kalinin region. Their graves were found side by side with those of Polish prisoners.
It's impossible to identify the bodies of Soviet prisoners. Soviet victims of repressions were taken to the burial place in underwear or stark naked. And later, in a bid to cover up their tracks, NKVD used a special acid and lime to dissolve human remains in the soil.
Several times a year, activists from the Mednaya Memorial Complex in northwest Russia go on an expedition through villages in the Tver region, known in Soviet times as Kalinin. They meet relatives of the locals who, like the Poles, were executed at Mednaya. These people and the relatives of dead Polish officers have something in common. All that's left of their murdered loved ones are a few faded photos.
I remember my father's sobs when I saw him in prison. I adored him, and he loved me.
Many years have passed since the relatives of the victims of the repressions were first interviewed. Gradually, historians came to the conclusion that the Poles had no chance of escaping death. Stalin's terror machine was crushing friend and foe alike, making no distinction between them. Mednaya and Katyn are just two cases in point.
Given that system of government, many Polish officers and men had no chance of survival. Any prisoner discussing Poland's future was immediately classified as a suspect at the time of Stalin's reign of terror. People of any other nationality would have been dealt with in the same manner if they had found themselves in the same situation.
2010 marks 70 years since the execution of the Polish prisoners of war. A memorial service was held in the Katyn forest on April 7th. The ceremony was attended by relatives of the dead and leading political figures.
When we were at the Polish military cemetery in Katyn on April the 7th, the Prime Ministers of Russia and Poland, Putin and Tusk, were standing nearby. My father thought it was a historic moment.
But marking the anniversary was to take a tragic turn. The plane carrying Polish President Lech Kaczynski and many other senior officials crashed near Katyn as it tried to land near Smolensk. Relatives of the wartime prison victims were also heading for the memorial ceremony there. They died along with the president.
That was simply incredible. Our family couldn't believe it. When tragedy struck again, this time on April the 10th, 2010, my mother kept saying, "This can't be true." My granddad was murdered, and my father was killed in an air crash, almost in the same place. The two sites are separated by only a few dozen kilometers.
For many in Russia, the air crash was a personal tragedy. For days, people brought flowers to the Polish embassy in Moscow. A Russian state television channel showed Andrzej Wajda's poignant film, Katyn. Wajda admits he had a hard time making it. There was not a single collection of stories about Katyn. For that reason, his work's based on memoirs, including his mother's recollections that Wajda heard as a young man.
I'm happy to know that the film Katyn has been shown to such a vast audience, so that they could evaluate it and hear what a Polish film director has to say. I'm thankful to all of those who made this possible. This is a good step forward towards reconciliation between us.
Ostashkov. At first sight, nothing seems to have changed here over the years. The great-grandchildren of those who saw the Polish prisoners of war now play in the yards. Boris Karpov is 85. He's been teaching in the local school all his working life. For a long time, he could not share his memories with anyone. Finally, the days come when a documentary about the events of 1940 will be shown on Russian television. Several years ago, film director Andrzej Wajda came here in person to listen about how the Polish prisoners were brought from the Ostashkov camp to their place of execution. Boris became blind 2 years ago. Now he can only listen to what the film has to say.
What sort of lists are they?
They give the names of people taken out of a camp. People could easily go astray, but their families and the army want to see them. I keep a diary, and diaries don't catch fire, you know.
Buttons. All that will be left of us is the buttons on our uniforms.
Of course, I feel sympathy with Andrzej Wajda and the Polish people. As it turns out, grief unites nations. We feel compassion for the Polish people because of that tragedy. Grief brings us closer together.
It's too soon to draw a line under the Katyn case. Work is still underway to find more places where Polish prisoners of war are buried, as some died while in transit to the prison camps. There are also continued efforts to gather information about the victims of Stalin's reign of terror, who were buried in mass graves together with the Poles. If the bells were to honor every single person buried at Medneia and Katyn, they would have to toll continuously for many days.